In this video, we will look at how can we use the Excel diagram to examine assumption 2 for the regression model that the standard deviation of the residual is the same regardless of the given value of x. So the method we are learning can be used to test the simple linear regression model and the multiple regression model. Since in the multiple regression model we have multiple x, and in order to use just one diagram to examine assumption 2, and we will use the plot called residual against estimated y value scatter plot to examine if the assumption 2 is valid or not. So the criterion to help you to decide if the assumption 2 is valid or not is the amount of the scatter should be approximately the same for all values of estimated y. So if you look at the pattern of this diagram, so if you try to draw a boundary for these scatters, you will see it's like a square shape instead of cone shapes. So as the y change, the estimated value y change, you cannot see the change of your residuals. So make sure you look at pay attention on the vertical and the horizontal axis for this diagram. So the vertical axis is the residual value, and the horizontal axis is the estimated y value. So now let's look at how can we use Excel to get this diagram and make the decision to examine the assumption 2. So we will go back to look at our GPA example. So as we get the Excel output, and you should be able to see this area called residual output. So under the residual output, you will see the first column is observations, second column is predicted GPA. And if you go back to think about this question, so the y variable in this example is the GPA. So the predicted GPA actually, this column is telling us the predicted value for y. And third column is residual, and the last column is the standard residuals. So in this example, and we want to create the residual against the predicted y value. So by default, when you insert the scatter plot, and the first column in your data set, the Excel will recognize as axis value, and the second column, the Excel will recognize as a vertical, the y-axis value. So in order to create the residual against the predicted y value scatter plot, what you need to do is just select these two columns. So when you select these two columns, make sure you include the title or label for each column. So when I selected these two columns, I included predicted GPA and the residuals. And then now find the insert from the Excel, and then find charts area, and choose the last one called the insert scatter or bubble chart, and choose the first one called the basic scatter plot. Then after you clicked it, so you should be able to get this scatter plot. So for this case, so the residual against the predicted y value. So the vertical axis is our residual, and the horizontal axis is our predicted y value, predicted GPA. So now in order to decide if the assumption 2 is valid or not, and you need to check the pattern of your diagram, compare the pattern of your diagram with this criterion. The amount of the scatter should be approximately the same for all values of the estimated y. So if you go back to look at this diagram, so what you found is, so the residual actually is, except the first observation, so the residual gets smaller and smaller as your predicted y value get bigger and bigger. So you can see at the beginning, the largest is 0.6, and the smallest the negative 0.6. So the range of your residual is very big at the beginning, and then it ends up at very small, almost equal to 0. So which means in this case, assumption 2, the residual is independent from your x value is violated. So assumption 2 is violated. And also, if you look trying to draw a boundary for this residual against predicted y scatter plot, you will find it's not like a square shape, rectangle shape. Instead, it looks like a cone. So the assumption 2 is violated.